Hello, everyone. My name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about narrators. We're going to be defining them and just talking about their significance when it comes to literature, books, novels, and short stories, because they play a very important part in allowing us as the reader to understand the work that we're going through. Whatever book you pick up, it could be an advertisement, a short story. As long as it's writing, there is a voice of narration, and there is like a point of view that it has to be coming from. So one common narration or perspective or point of view that we often encounter when it comes to literature is first person narrator, or a first person point of view. And that's when you're usually in a character's head, or you're getting the story is being told through a character. It's very significant that when you start reading a book, you really need to pay attention to what type of narrator that you get, because when you get a first person narrator, you have to be skeptical. You have to be able to look at the piece that you're looking at in different ways, because first person narrators are not always unbiased. They're not impartial. That's what I'm trying to say here. They're not impartial. They will look at things through their perspectives. They will tell you their own beliefs. They will narrate the story. If they're narrating the story, they'll almost a lot of times put themselves in a good position, or they'll always kind of like rationalize what they're doing to make it look good. And first person narrators, they're just not, you should never trust them completely. Yesterday I uploaded a video called A&P, and it's this main character by the name of Sammy, and he's telling us the story. He's telling us what he's seeing in this supermarket. The short story is by John Updike, and Sammy is our narrator. He tells us everything that's happening. He tells how other characters act. But his powers as a first or a first person narrator, it's very limited. We're really kind of like only seeing things through his mind. We're not getting that omniscient narrator. We're not getting a third person narrator. That narrator that can tell us about people's feelings, people's moods, people's minds, and their ideas, their thought processes. So first person narrator, it's usually where the narrator is using I did this, I am this, or this happened. So it's coming from one perspective, from one person's point of view. You oftentimes get the person's ideals or the person's perspective. First person narrators can be very interesting too. If you ever read The Book Thief is where Death is the narrator of that, which is very fascinating. And Death is telling us what he thinks and how he sees the world, and how he sees the characters, and how they go through life. But even that, Death is within this book that I'm talking about, within The Book Thief. Death is this omniscient being, but at the same time, the most trustworthy narrator from my perspective is the third person narrator. The third person narrator usually, from my perspective, I think usually carries the ideas of the author of the book. The third person narrator tells you things how they are usually. And sometimes they oftentimes tell you things that maybe they kind of control your thinking, because narrators are very important because they control how you see a work, because depending on who's narrating the book, if it's a particular character, if it's this omniscient narrator, if it's a second person perspective, your view of the book changes, your idea of the book changes sometimes. And the thing is, like, what to keep in mind here is to always question the narrator. Even if the narrator is omniscient, you need to question the narrator so you can get the best ideal out of the book. So before we go into second person narration or the second person perspective, last thing I'll say is first person is all about I. So this character is telling you what's happening. It's most of the time it's not it's bias, or the first person narrator tries to make you feel sympathy for him or her, or try to see things through his or her eyes. So the first person narrator is someone that it might be difficult to trust, and it's always to always look underneath the surface of what's happening and try to understand the story from other characters' perspectives. Don't just take the first person narrator's word for it. And a lot of times the first person narrators are not reliable. They're not reliable. Don't trust them 100%. When it comes to second person narration, or the second person perspective, usually it's talking about you. It's referring to the audience, or it's referring to something that's happening to you, right? It usually uses you. It's not using I. Or it's not completely omniscient. It's always usually referring to something. So, you went to the mall today and you saw that this and this happened. So the second person narration, not a lot of authors use it. Most books, most people usually use first person and third person. Second person, it usually feels like you are definitely talking to the reader. I feel like Jane Eyre probably used this, because I think there's parts of it that says "Dear Reader." So when the author is referring to the reader, or talking to the reader, or kind of like pulling in the reader to the book, or kind of like, whenever it's referencing you, it's second person. It can be used. I mean, I've seen a lot of authors use it, and it's it works out and it brings you a different perspective. But that the second person narration is usually, it's not used that much, but it really makes it, I guess, more personal, because it pulls in the reader. It makes the reader think about his or her life. If you ever read Invisible Man, I think there's a line where it goes, I'm an invisible man, you're an invisible man. I'm paraphrasing here, and that kind of like, it's referring to the character and what's going on within the work, but it's also kind of like reaching into the real world and pulling you into it, and maybe talking about your life and where you are, in your life. The third person narration, I guess you could say it's the most trustworthy. It really depends on the work, but the third person narration, the third person perspective, that being is usually omniscient. For the most part, I would say one play that really reveals to us what the third person narrator is about is probably Our Town. I think by Thornton Wilder. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's by Thornton Wilder. Our Town, we see the stage manager pretty much have superpowers, because he's going in and out of scenes. He's in the play, he's not in the play, he's referring to the audience, he's talking to the people in the audience, he's talking to the characters, he's telling us about the town. He has superpowers. He can be everywhere and anywhere. The third person narration, the third person omniscient narrator is pretty much a god, because they can go forward in time, back in time, and go into the present, tell us about people's mindsets, their ideas, their thoughts, their emotions, what's going to happen to them. Sometimes the third person narration tells us if the character dies or not, or lives or not, or is in love or not. The third person narrator is also a creep, because they can be anywhere. They can be in a character's house and tell us what's happening in their bedrooms, and tell us what's happening in their bathrooms. The third person narration can do anything and everything, because it's usually never, I would say never, a character within the plot or within the book. Maybe there is a book out there where the third person narrator is within the book itself, but that's really strange. Usually the author takes on that third person narrator, or maybe it doesn't even refer to the author. Maybe it's just this voice that's just telling you what happened, and you don't know nothing about this voice. It doesn't relate to the story. It's just the voice of the book, and that sometimes it's more reliable, but at the same time, don't completely trust the third person narrator, because the third person narrator is still in control of everything. Just like, when you're watching a movie and the scene changes, the director and the people who make the film, they choose when to change the scene. I mean, you might be watching, I don't know, a war in this scene, and in the next scene it just flips over in a time period, and now you're in, I don't know, the war room where it's planning on how to defeat the enemy. So when you're watching movies, scenes change from here to there. You don't know who's changing the scene, and that's not how life works. I mean, I don't just cut out while I'm telling this video and I'm in my kitchen, and then we're in my kitchen and I'm cooking. So there's no, I'm just speaking to you in this video. If there's this omniscient being, the omniscient being would be able to switch scenes, switch topics. That happens in movies. I mean, if you ever watch Law and Order, you'll be in one scene and then it blocks out, and then there's like letters on the bottom that says, Brooklyn, this day, whatever. I mean, we're never introduced to the beings that are, switching the scenes, but that does happen. So something is doing this. This power is doing it. And the third person narration, the third person perspective, is usually this power that can do anything. Tell us when people grow up. Tell us what people is going through. Tell us what they're facing. And that power can be good and bad, and it can tell you exactly what's going on in the character's life. And pretty much they control the narrative of the story and what's going to happen within the story. So, the third person narrator is very important, very significant, and usually they just make the story better, or I guess more reliable. But that's how those three, the first, second, and third ways of narrating, or first, second, and third perspectives or point of views of narration. Those three are the most common. It's pretty much, I think, those are what authors use. And even when you're writing, if you're not using I, or you're not using you, you're usually using the third person narration. It's usually, third person narration is probably the most common. I'll just say that. I think that's mostly used in all types of works and documents and books and short stories. When you're reading, don't just read the story and don't just take the author or the narrator's word for it. Question the narrator. Keep track of what the narrator is saying, especially when the narrator takes you aside and describes the scene to you and describes ideas and presents ideas to you. Make sure you question the ideas. Make sure you think about the ideas that are being presented. Make sure that you see what's happening, because narrators are not always 100% with you. They can lead you in one place, and they can, make you think something that you're not supposed to. So always bring your own perspective. Don't just pick up a book and short story and just say this is how it is. And even when you're done reading it, think about, ask some questions, and don't just agree with a book or a poem. That's where your analytical skills come in, and your critical thinking skills come in. Don't just take it word for word. See what's underneath the surface. See what else might be happening. And make sure, don't just trust the narrators, because the narrators are not always on your side. But yeah, that's how to think about narration. I think that will help you guys in just looking at books and thinking about books more, and see where the main ideas are going. Because narration is probably the most important thing when it comes to a book. Because every piece of literature has a narrator, and without the narrators, masterpieces in literature would not be what they are. So that's all I had to say about narration and just the definition of it and what it contains. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and/or comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video.